A cold drizzle pattered against the windshield as the city lights flickered in the darkness. The streets, slick with rain, reflected the red and green of traffic signals, casting a glow over the quiet roads. Inside his cab, Daniel gripped the steering wheel, his fingers tapping absent-mindedly as he waited at a red light. It had been a slow night, just a couple of short rides. Nothing out of the ordinary. He sighed, glancing at the clock. Almost midnight. Maybe it was time to call it a night. Just as he reached for the radio, his phone buzzed. A new ride request. He hesitated for a moment, but then accepted it. The pickup location was only a few blocks away. With a quick glance in the rearview mirror, he switched on his signal and pulled onto the empty road. When he arrived, he spotted a woman standing under a dimly lit street lamp, holding her belly. She was visibly pregnant, her face tense with discomfort. She clutched her phone in one hand, while her other arm wrapped protectively around her stomach. Her dark hair was damp from the rain, and she looked exhausted. But more than that, she looked afraid. Daniel quickly pulled over and rolled down the window. "You called for a ride?" She nodded hurriedly. "Yes. Please, I need to get to the hospital. Now." There was urgency in her voice, a slight tremble that made Daniel's heart race. Without hesitation, he unlocked the doors, and she climbed in, struggling slightly. As soon as she was settled, he pulled away from the curb, his foot pressing a little harder on the gas than usual. "You okay back there?" he asked, glancing at her through the rearview mirror. She nodded but was breathing heavily. I think the baby is coming." His grip tightened on the wheel. "All right, don't worry. We'll get you there fast." The rain picked up, streaking the windshield as the wipers worked furiously. The hospital was about 15 minutes away, but every second felt longer. Daniel's mind raced with thoughts. What if they didn't make it in time? What if something went wrong? "Is there someone I should call for you?" he asked. The woman shook her head. "No, just get me there." Her voice was strained, her hands gripping the seat. Daniel had been a taxi driver for years, and he had seen all kinds of people. Businessmen in a rush, couples on dates, rowdy teenagers after a night out. But this was different. This wasn't just another passenger. This was a life-changing moment, one that he had somehow become a part of. The streets blurred past, the traffic light mercifully light at this late hour. Every now and then, he would check the mirror, watching as the woman breathed through the pain. He wanted to reassure her, to tell her it would be okay. But what did he know about childbirth? He was just a guy driving a cab. Then, suddenly, a sharp gasp filled the car. "It's coming faster than I thought," she whimpered. Daniel's heart pounded. "Hold on, we're almost there." He pressed harder on the gas, weaving through the streets as safely as he could without slowing down. The hospital was just a few blocks away now. He could already see the glowing red emergency sign in the distance. "Almost there," he repeated, as much for himself as for her. Then just as he turned into the hospital driveway, the woman let out a soft, almost relieved sob. Daniel barely had time to process what was happening before the doors to the emergency room burst open and nurses rushed toward them. He slammed the brakes, jumped out of the car, and ran to the back seat, helping as they carefully lifted the woman onto a wheelchair. She clutched his arm for a moment, her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite place. Gratitude, fear, maybe both. "Thank you," she whispered. Daniel nodded, stepping back as the nurses wheeled her inside. He stood there for a moment, his chest rising and falling, trying to shake off the adrenaline coursing through him. Just as he turned to head back to his car, a voice called out, "Sir." He turned to see one of the nurses hurrying back toward him. "She asked if you could wait," the nurse said. Daniel frowned. Wait, for what? The nurse smiled slightly. She said there's something you need to know. His mind raced. What could it be? Was the baby okay? Was she okay? And why did she want him, just a taxi driver, to stay? As he stood there under the glow of the hospital lights, rain still falling softly around him, he realized this night was far from over. And whatever came next, he wasn't sure he was ready for it. Daniel hesitated for a moment, unsure if he should stay. He was just the driver. Why would she want to see him again? But something about the way she had looked at him, the urgency in her voice, made him stay. He leaned against his cab, the hospital doors glowing in the dim night as he waited. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, the streets quiet except for the occasional ambulance siren in the distance. Minutes felt like hours. He glanced at the hospital entrance every few seconds, wondering what could be taking so long. He didn't even know her name. She had been in too much pain, and he had been too focused on getting her to the hospital safely to ask. Yet now, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was supposed to be here, that there was something unfinished about this night. Finally, the nurse returned. She wants to see you, she said, with a warm but curious expression, as if she too was wondering what this was all about. Daniel followed her inside, the bright hospital lights making him squint for a moment. The hall smelled of antiseptic, and soft voices murmured from nearby rooms. He walked behind the nurse, his heartbeat quickening with every step. When they reached the room, the nurse pushed the door open gently. Inside, the woman lay in a hospital bed, looking exhausted but relieved. A tiny bundle was nestled in her arms, wrapped snugly in a hospital blanket. The baby's small face peeked out, eyes barely open. Daniel stepped inside cautiously, his hands shoved in his pockets. You wanted to see me? The woman looked up at him, her expression soft but serious. Yes, she said, her voice hoarse. She took a deep breath before continuing. I never got to thank you properly. Daniel shook his head. You don't have to. I was just doing my job. She gave a small, tired smile. No, you weren't. You went out of your way. You didn't panic. You got me here safely. Her voice wavered slightly, and she looked down at the baby in her arms. And if it wasn't for you, I don't know what would have happened. Daniel didn't know what to say. He wasn't used to being the hero of anyone's story. He was just a guy trying to make ends meet, driving strangers around the city every night. But the way she spoke, the way she looked at him, it felt like he had done something more. She took another breath, her fingers gently stroking the baby's tiny hand. There's something else, she said, her eyes meeting his. Something I need to tell you. Daniel frowned slightly. What is it? She hesitated, as if searching for the right words. My name is Emily, she finally said. And I know this is going to sound strange, but I think I know you. He blinked. Know me? Emily nodded slowly. I didn't realize it at first. Everything happened so fast, and I was in so much pain. But when I saw your face in the car, something felt familiar. She swallowed. I think you knew my mother. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. His mother. He hadn't heard those words in years. His mother had passed away over a decade ago. He shook his head, confused. I don't understand. Emily hesitated again, her eyes glistening. Her name was Margaret. Margaret Sullivan. The name hit him like a sudden wave, knocking the breath out of his lungs. His grip on his jacket tightened as memories rushed back. Margaret. He hadn't heard that name in so long. It was a name tied to a past he had tried to leave behind. He looked at Emily, searching for any resemblance. And then, as he focused on her eyes, he saw it. The same soft brown, the same warmth. His heart pounded. How did you know her? He finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily exhaled shakily. She was my mother. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. Daniel couldn't speak, couldn't think. This stranger, the woman he had rushed to the hospital tonight, was the daughter of someone he had once cared about deeply, someone who had been a part of his life, before everything had changed. Emily's voice broke through his thoughts. I never got to meet my father. My mother. She never talked much about him. I only know he left before I was born. She glanced down, almost as if she was afraid to say the next part. But I remember her talking about someone named Daniel. A long time ago. Daniel's throat tightened. He could hear the unspoken question in her voice. Was it possible? Had fate brought them together in this taxi, on this rainy night, in this unexpected way? His mind raced, memories colliding with the present. He thought of Margaret, of the past. He had locked away, and now, standing in this hospital room, looking at the baby in Emily's arms, he realized he wasn't just a driver who had given a woman a ride to the hospital. He was part of the story, and the truth was about to change. Everything. Daniel felt the weight of Emily's words settle deep in his chest. The room, though warm, suddenly felt colder. His pulse pounded in his ears as his mind struggled to catch up with what was happening. Could this really be true? Could the woman he had just driven through the storm be connected to a past he had tried to forget? He swallowed hard, his voice unsteady. Your mother, Margaret, he said slowly, almost afraid to say her name out loud. She and I were close. A long time ago. Emily's fingers tightened around the hospital blanket. Her eyes locked onto his. I thought so, she whispered. I remembered the name. She mentioned you once when I was little, just in passing. But she never told me the full story. Daniel exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. I met her when we were young, he began, his voice distant, as if he was speaking to the past, instead of the woman in front of him. We were more than friends for a while, but life happened. Things got complicated. I had dreams of leaving town, of making something of myself. And she had her own struggles. He hesitated. I never knew she was pregnant. Emily looked down at the baby in her arms. She raised me on her own. She was strong, but she carried a lot of pain. She glanced back up at him, her voice softer. Did you ever try to find her again? Daniel clenched his jaw, guilt seeping in. I wanted to. I thought about it so many times, but I convinced myself it was too late, that she had moved on, that I was just a piece of the past she didn't need anymore. He shook his head. I never knew she had a daughter. I never knew about you. Emily studied him for a moment, as if trying to read the truth in his face. Then, after a long silence, she exhaled and said, Maybe we were meant to meet tonight. Daniel let out a breathless laugh, one filled with disbelief. I drive a cab in a city with millions of people. What are the chances that, of all the passengers I could have picked up tonight, it would be you? He glanced at the baby. And now, here we are. Emily nodded, her expression unreadable. Then she shifted slightly, adjusting the baby in her arms. Would you like to hold her? Daniel's heart skipped. He had never held a newborn before. He wasn't sure he even knew how, but something in Emily's voice, something gentle, something open, made him nod. She carefully extended the baby toward him, and with hesitant hands, Daniel took her, cradling the tiny bundle as if she were made of glass. The baby stirred slightly, her tiny fingers curling near her face. He stared down at her, feeling something unfamiliar and overwhelming stir inside him. I named her Maggie, Emily said quietly. After my mom. Daniel felt a lump form in his throat. He blinked rapidly, trying to steady himself. Maggie, he murmured, looking at the baby's peaceful face. At that moment, something inside him shifted. All the years of regret, all the roads he hadn't taken, all the times he had wondered what might have been, it all led here, to this night, to this child. He looked back at Emily. I don't know what to say. She gave him a small, knowing smile. You don't have to say anything. I just thought, you should know. Daniel nodded, still staring at Maggie. The rain outside had stopped now, the city quiet, as if the whole world had paused for this moment. He wasn't sure what came next. He wasn't sure if this was the start of something new, or just a single, fleeting moment of closure. But he did know one thing. He wasn't just a stranger in a taxi anymore. And as he gently handed baby Maggie back to her mother, he realized that maybe, just maybe, this ride had taken him exactly where he was always meant to go.